We've got a great session planned. Clearly, in an industry that's creating so much attention, what do we invest in? What makes sense? How do we read a balance sheet? How do we know it's rhetoric or what is reality? Sumit Mehta is going to bring his 15 years of experience in Wall Street, 5 years of direct experience in the cannabis business to tell us the business of doing business when it comes to investment. Sumit, come on up, please. Thank you. Morning.
For how many of you is this your first cannabis conference? Welcome. And how many folks are already invested in the industry either through capital deployment or employment? Congratulations and hello. Well, this is one of the most exciting times in one of the most exciting industries in the world today. This year has marked the moment that the largest capital market came online, and also the moment that the largest consumer market came online. So I want the session to be fairly interactive, informal, and hopefully informative. And given the short amount of time we have today, I'm going to run through some slides, provide an overview of the industry for those of you who are new to it, highlight some of the challenges that ought to be familiar to those of you who are in it, and then talk about ways in which we can get involved from an investment standpoint. And then I'll open it up to questions. We should have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So cannabis, perhaps one of the oldest medicines on the planet, certainly one of the most valuable plants in the world, and arguably one of the most misunderstood. Many of you have likely seen some of these numbers that are quite often quoted by media. But what do they mean? What is $12 billion? Well, $12 billion, which is the quoted size of the US market, is the total amount of cannabis sold legally all over the United States. It does not count the cannabis sold illegally, which is likely 6 to 10 times this number, nor does it count all of the money spent around the plant, which is roughly twice what is spent on the plant. What might be apparent in this chart is the growth of the legal market, which is represented by the bars on the bottom, at the expense of the illegal market, the red line on top. What I hope is also apparent in this chart is that the legal market is growing far faster than the illegal market is declining. This can be explained by the arrival of new entrants in the marketplace. But what I also hope is apparent in this chart is that the adult use market, the lighter part of the bars, is growing much faster than the medical market. In fact, in states which have normalized and have had time to mature post-adult use legalization, we see the balance trending towards a 90-10 ratio of adult use to medical use. The medical markets in the US, in states that have legalized, are disappearing. Well, all of this growth, all of this spending comes with a healthy amount of tax revenue as well. One can look at the tax revenue at the bottom in the red and see that it doubles in size between now and 2021. One can also see the total output maintains its 2-to-1 ratio as the market grows at its blistering pace. What I hope you take away from this graph is that the total impact of the cannabis market is far greater than either one of the numbers on the top suggests. But how high is 27%? Where does that number rank if one looks at all of the industries that have grown, that are north of $5 billion in the US in the last 50 years? Any guesses? Pretty lively audience today. So let's look at the fastest growing industries. We've had home video, we've had basic cable, and we've had broadband adoption, or the internet boom. Three of the fastest growing industries in the US since 1950. Well, cannabis ranks number 2, second only to internet adoption. Of course, leading us to conclude that perhaps the only thing Americans like more than cannabis is their Wi-Fi. And all of this growth, all of this excitement, all of this size also comes with very healthy profit margins. When we compare cannabis margins to other regulated substances, we do see a pretty discernible difference. We do expect this to normalize over time, but this is high in the moment and is an opportunity for investors to take advantage of. Cultivation and retail have experienced the largest year-over-year growth in investment if one looks at all of the sectors that are available for investment and have been for at least 3 years. It's not too much of a surprise given how much activity is going on in both of these sectors, nor is it too much of a surprise given how margins have begun to normalize at both ends of the supply chain. What might be somewhat of a surprise to some is the growth we're seeing this year in biotech and pharma. When one looks at cannabis as medicine, and when one looks at the 742 disease conditions that this plant is able to address, perhaps it explains why there's so much activity and so much interest from the pharmaceutical complex. Well, pharma companies have had 2 issues, one more recent, one not quite so recent. For the past 15 years, pharmaceutical companies have been reeling from patent expiration issues. There simply aren't enough multi-billion-dollar drugs to replace what's coming off patent. The second issue pharma companies are facing is from legalization of cannabis, to the tune of 15 to 27% decline in opioid consumption in states that have matured with medical legalization. Well, cannabis, the pharma complex has deep pockets, and cannabis is providing a second sucker punch to their guts. And that explains this massive growth in the pharma investment space that we've noticed this year. Well, all of this growth, all of this excitement, is not without its challenges. Can someone name some of the challenges in the cannabis space? Stigmatism, yeah, or stigma. Anyone else?
The lack of recognizing different products and allowing them to be legalized.
Lack of recognizing different products, sure.
Problems crossing borders and territories.
Trade restrictions, problems crossing borders, yeah.
Lack of medical evidence.
Lack of medical evidence. And it will cease to be fragmented as it becomes mature, as most mature markets tend to move towards an oligopolistic structure. We currently have 12,000 licensed businesses in the US and over 20,000 unlicensed businesses in the US. That represents 32,000 investment opportunities. A daunting task for those of us inside the industry to look through to find the ones that are gems. Certainly an impossible one for most of those that are in a fully legal environment. You're attractive enough to get purchased, or you go out of business. And from an investment standpoint, it's very important to sift through, understand how this industry is going to consolidate as it becomes more mature, and work to at least tilt your portfolio towards those companies that have the best shot of surviving or getting acquired. Another issue is fracturing. You've got a cannabis company, and the gentleman in the front mentioned trade restrictions. They're certainly very valid. In fact, alcohol trade restrictions are still in place that were put in place post-prohibition. What is your total addressable market? If you're investing in a company in California, is it different than investing in a company in Colorado versus a company in Florida? Colorado has over 2,000 licenses, Florida has 13. It's a slight difference in addressable market with the population of those two states and a large difference in competition. given the license structure that I just mentioned. One point to note on this slide is that the bottom 4 states alone are 30% of the total cannabis market in the US. So pay attention when you're making investments as to where your target company can actually function. Another issue is pricing. Can anyone tell me what the average retail price for a pound of cannabis was in the US last year? $2,000? Anyone else?
It would depend on the quality, obviously, but yeah, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500, maybe 3,500 American.
3,500 American. The average retail price for a pound of cannabis in the US last year was $5,100. That's 1,350 times more expensive than spinach, which was $3.83. Can anyone tell me what the average retail price for an ounce of cannabis extract in the US was last year? Any guesses? I'm sorry? 500, okay. Anyone else? 2,000. You're close. It was $1,400, which means that I could have bought an ounce of gold last night and had a couple $100 in my pocket this morning. Can anyone tell me what the retail price for a barrel of cannabis oil was in the US last year?
How do you define a barrel?
55 gallons. Crude closed at $60 this morning, or last night, as comparison. I'm sorry?
$7 million.
$7 million. Anyone else? $50,000. So if you're an investor in the space, it's important to know these numbers. They make a very large difference when you're looking at what your target company is telling you they can earn. The average retail price of a 55-gallon barrel of cannabis oil last year in the US was $5 million. Needless to say, these prices have some room to fall, and fall they will, as they have been at the rate of 2% a month for the past couple of years. It is important to differentiate between indoor, outdoor, and greenhouse flower and the different trajectories that each of those will enjoy. And it's also important to look at your target investments and understand whether this price drop has implications for your target company's revenue or your target company's cost of goods. One has declining margins while the other has expanding margins. So when one looks from a sector perspective on portfolio construction in cannabis, and when one looks to diversify and also hedge against this impending and continual price decline, it's really important to understand how this plays in your target company's financial outcomes. Another issue someone mentioned is the stigma. And I want to touch on the political climate in the US for a second. There is a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of concern about the federal-state conflict in the United States with cannabis. After all, cannabis is, as is LSD and heroin, a Schedule I substance. More dangerous than cocaine, which is Schedule II. But that has only a question of time before that changes. Because when I look at this map, I see 31 states with medical laws. I see 10 plus DC with adult use laws. I see the very construct of the House and the Senate changing such that it is politically unfeasible to oppose legalization in the United States now. This is a bipartisan issue with 94% support for medical and 72% support for adult use. I see full federal legalization by 2021, and given the recent events of the last few months with the likes of Booker, Boehner, Gardner, and McConnell all changing tunes, I would say that the warning sign on the side mirror of your cars is likely true for the windshield of cannabis legalization. I'm very excited to know that the federal government of the United States can finally turn its attention to far more pressing and dangerous issues that impact many more families in deadly ways, issues that also include falling coconuts and selfies. This is not just a US issue, this is also a global phenomenon. When one looks around the world, one can see over 30 countries that have amended cannabis legalization and have moved towards decriminalizing or legalizing at various levels. I just came back to the United States from an extended trip through Ecuador, which has now issued licenses, through Hong Kong, which hosted its first cannabis symposium, through China, which has issued licenses and is the largest cultivator of hemp on the planet, also the largest holder of cannabis patents on the planet, at over 50% of global share on each, and through India, which has had its first cannabis conference in New Delhi 2 weeks ago. Attended by the Prime Minister's office, it has also issued licenses. So this train has left the station, and if one looks at any level of perceived risk, one also has to look at the level of actual risk, which is pretty low, and understand that alpha lies squarely between those two. So how does one get involved in this industry? There are many ways to deploy capital in the cannabis space. One can invest in funds that are dedicated towards deploying capital. I would pay attention to the underlying strategies and ensure that if you're investing in multiple funds, you also have fund diversification, not just target company diversification. Of course, in Canada, you're used to public markets being very open to the space, and you've seen the extreme wealth creation and wealth destruction in the last couple of years. There are direct investments. Many of the 32,000 companies are very high quality. There are investor groups such as the Arcview Group, where I've spent quite a few years, that collectively have deployed a couple $100 million into a couple hundred companies, all through angel and private investment. Thanks to the Jobs Act of 2014, we have crowdfunding opportunities, and dedicated cannabis companies focused on driving crowdfunding into their target investments. And of course, not to be confused with Canopy in Canada, Canopy Boulder is an accelerator that takes investments and deploys them into underlying companies that they then accelerate at a seed stage with a venture-driven model at a seed stage. What does the future hold for cannabis? I see an extremely bright future, not just for this plant, but also for our planet, our people, and our profits. I see a time when movie theaters will move from THX sound to THC sound, where restaurants will offer you cannabis pairings, not just wine pairings, where cannabis tinctures will be sold on every pharmacy shelf in the country. And this is not just the future, it's also the past. 1934, cannabis tinctures were sold on every pharmacy shelf in America. And while the pharmacies had different names, the manufacturers of these tinctures might sound familiar to you. They were Abbott Labs, Eli Lilly, and Merck, to name a few. The implication of legalization of this plant is tremendous when one looks at our food, our fuel, our fiber, our paper, our medicine, our environment. When one looks at social justice or civil rights or even cognitive liberty. I'm extremely optimistic that as we unlock this plant from this 82-year period of prohibition that we have put it in, that we will look back and think about this period as an absolute aberration of rational thought. I'm extremely optimistic that we will soon arrive at a day when we can stop putting each other in cages for having a relationship with a vegetable. And I'm extremely optimistic that as we free this plant towards the potential it possesses and always has, that we will weave the social fabric around us just a little bit tighter. Because after all, what makes us human is less ourselves and more each other. So thank you for that, and I'll open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
Is your company specialized only in venture capital investments, or you also physically found a licensed producer for someone who is interested to buy his business?
Question is, does my company specialize in investments or also in license applications? It's the former. We work to bring investments to market and help investors place capital.
It's only investors. I got it.
Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Just a question about your stats. What are your stats in USD or Canadian pesos?
USD, no Canadian pesos. Yes, sir.
You have the Marlboro featured in one of your later slides. Do you see any other major cigarette producers getting involved in the cannabis space, or another big conglomerate industry starting to invest soon?
Question is, do I see any other conglomerates investing in the cannabis space, as I had Marlboro on one of my slides? There is no doubt that when the big boys are allowed to play, they will. Big food, big ag, big liquor, big pharma, big tobacco, big entertainment, big hospitality are all just waiting for the feds to blow the whistle. When the announcement of Constellation investing in Canopy was made, the two names I cared about most on that press release were not Constellation or Canopy. They were Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch. They led the deal. When one looks at patent filing, and I went back to 1942 to look at 1,500 cannabis patents to figure out who was filing them, when they were filed, and why, one can look at the peak of patent filing from Big Pharma, and it was 2006. When you speak to CVS, they will tell you they had a cannabis business plan in 1993 that was 300 pages long. So if one looks at the other legalized, regulated, psychoactive substances, one can point to caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. One can also point to sugar and opioids, but let's start with the first three. Caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol have been as socialized into our consciences as the smoke break, the coffee break, and the happy hour. The implication that cannabis has as a healthy psychoactive substance is tremendous, as it can impact all of the chronic stress that an over-caffeinated society has, as it can replace smoking tobacco with something that is far less deadly and has far more positive impact on the world in general. And certainly, we have seen reduction in alcohol consumption to the tune of about 15% in states that have legalized. We can also see non-alcoholic beers, as an example, that are out in the market, that have 40 to 60 calories, that are highly hydrating, that have vitamins, and have a couple milligrams of THC. All living creatures have an affinity for psychoactive experiences. It's not just humans. The Amazon jungle has a far greater use of drugs than the Burning Man Festival. This is not necessary for survival, but we see it in sheep, we see it in dolphins, we see it in most living creatures. So as we continue to look at substances that help us weave the neural pathways in our minds a little bit differently, I absolutely see the large companies coming in and playing in a space that is not going away anytime soon. Yes, sir. Sumit, yeah.
First of all, I really appreciate your perspective and the way you're talking. Listening to a lot of financial guys and watching what's it called? James does this report, the finance letter. You're the first finance guy who has a deep relationship and understands the real context of civilization shift after almost a century of craziness. My question to you is, if anybody's watching what's really going on, this is about the legalization of every powerful psychedelic, and that suicidal
thank you for your compliment. Yes, psilocybin and MDMA are likely the next substances to get legalized. In fact, the FDA is in stage 3 clinical trials with MDMA for PTSD, to address PTSD issues.
And I'll just add, and there's an ongoing microdosing market that exists already here in BC and all these substances. Just like cannabis, you can't get cannabis legally, you can get illegally here. You can get all these things.
That's just an interesting time. Let's let him answer the question. Go ahead.
This industry is not being created because we are creating new habits. It's only being created because we're changing laws. So yes, we will see the laws change around the consumption of more plant-based medicine. And how one trains the medical professionals to deal with this comes down to a couple of different factors. Certainly the introduction of plant-based medicine education in medical schools would be a great start. But to any doctor that's not trained on how to administer cannabis, I would say caution. Side effects may include sleep and hunger. Relative to what the medical complex has become, which is a glorified sales tool for pharmaceutical companies, I very much am looking forward to this plant and many others like it replacing something that is killing, at least in America, 80,000 Americans a year. So, thanks very much. I have a luncheon site.
Luncheon, so
Pop out, but contact info is here. I'm here for the next couple of days. Happy to chat with anyone that has interest.
please, if you got more. I know there's a lot of questions. Thanks, Scott. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Guys, we have a break.